Mr. President, I suppose I and a lot of my colleagues had an opportunity to hear the President's speech this afternoon. It's very nice that the President is being engaged for the first time in the budget debate and the long-term fiscal problems of this country and the deficit problems of this country. It's good that he is following on with some of the recommendations of his own Deficit Reduction Commission. You have to remember a little less than a year ago, he appointed a Deficit Reduction Commission. They reported on December the 5th. It seems that they had broad bipartisan support because the 4 senators that were on there, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and probably very different political philosophies of the 2 of the 4, they have endorsed it. And then all of a sudden, since December the 5th until today, there's just been a lot of quiet on the part of the President of the United States about whether or not he likes what his Deficit Reduction Commission suggested. And I don't know the details of where he's coming from, whether he agrees with every detail that's in the Deficit Reduction Commission recommendations, but at least he is getting on board along the lines of what 64 senators, 32 Republicans and 32 Democrats said in a letter about a month ago to the President. We're ready to start tackling some of these big problems, but we need leadership. And maybe this speech today is an answer to that leadership. Or if I want to be cynical about it, I could say maybe the President gave his speech today because of the very positive comments that Congressman and Chairman Paul Ryan got for his budget ideas that he released last week. But the President also took advantage to renew the class warfare, the demagoguery of taxing the wealthy that doesn't contribute much to the debate. In fact, I think it makes it very difficult to bring people together. Or, if I want to be cynical, I could say this is maybe the President's first speech about his reelection. But either way, I think there's analysis of this that we got to look at very carefully and see, does it really do the economic good that's intended in the speech, even though it's welcome that the President is being engaged at this time. So I would give some reaction to some of the things that the President said. But I want this as background. From World War II through 2009, every dollar of new federal tax revenue coming into this Treasury resulted in $1.17 of new spending. Now just think of that. Every new dollar coming in wasn't a dollar that reduced the deficit. It was a dollar that resulted in $1.17 of additional spending. That's like a dog chasing its tail. It never catches it. And so we are sending a new dollar to Washington to do something about the budget deficit, and nothing really happens as a result of that, except more deficit. The President made the point that tax reductions in 2001 and 2003 added tremendously to the deficit that he inherited, or the part of the deficit that now exists. But in fact, the tax reductions of 2001 and 2003 resulted in more revenue to the federal treasury. The expanding economy, spurred by this tax relief acts of 2001 and 2003, helped to reduce the annual budget deficit from $412 billion in 2004 to $160 billion in 2007. Not because we taxed more, but because we taxed less and we had more economic activity as a result of it. Which brings me around to the principle of deficit reduction. Obviously, when I use the word that $1 additional taxes doesn't go to the bottom line, that doesn't do anything about the deficit. But on the expenditure side, reducing that and the economic growth that comes from it is what reduces the deficit. More economic activity. Even the most sincere arguments that raising taxes will reduce the deficit and the debt doesn't have history to back it up. Outside of Washington, it's obvious to people that the problem isn't that people are undertaxed, but Washington overspends. The voters said this so loud and clear in the last election. And elections are supposed to have consequences. And I think the budget agreement of midnight Friday night is evidence of words from the grassroots of America getting through to Washington, D.C., which I think most people at the grassroots are cynical would ever happen. And I suppose we got to do a lot more to prove to them that there might be a different day in Washington. But it was pretty loud and clear, the results of the last election and the message sent to Washington. Government spending increased by 22% during the last 2 years, an unsustainable level of increased expenditures. If we follow the budget proposed this year by President Obama, we would add another $13 trillion to our national debt over the next decade. This debt gets in the way of economic activity that creates jobs, and it's a terrible burden to leave to future generations. We talk dollars and cents when we talk about the deficit and the debt, but it's a moral issue of whether or not those of us of our generation ought to live high in the hog and leave the bill to young people like these pages here that have to pick up for it. It's a moral issue as much as it is an economic issue. This trillions of dollars of debt gets in the way of the economic activity that creates jobs. And it's a terrible burden on future generations. Washington needs to get behind policies that clamp down on spending, and as a result, we will grow the economy. Increased economic activity increases revenue to the federal treasury, enabling deficit and debt reduction. And we know that from a fact because from 97 to the year 2000, we actually, because of the growth of the economy, paid down $568 billion on the national debt during that period of time. The answer is not defending ways to grow government. Grow the economy, but you don't grow the economy by growing government. Getting back to the issue of the president making a big deal in his speech about the 2001 tax cuts being a major cause of the budget deficit, and probably the implication of the unfairness of it because there wasn't higher taxes on higher income people, I would suggest that the president is wrong in both regards. In 2001, tax cut included an across-the-board income tax rate reduction and reduced the tax rates on the lowest income people from 15% to 10%. And it resulted in removing millions of low-income people from the federal income tax rolls entirely. It increased the child tax credit from $500 to $1,000. The legislation included marriage penalty relief and the first ever tax deduction for tuition. 2 years later, after 9/11, the 2003 dividends and capital gains tax rate cuts spurred economic growth and created jobs. The result was more revenue to the federal treasury, not less. The expanding economy helped reduce the annual budget deficit, and I'm repeating these numbers because they're significant, from $412 billion in 2005 to $160 billion in 2007. I know it's counterintuitive to a lot of people to hear a member of the Senate say, you reduce marginal tax rates, you're going to bring revenue into the federal treasury, because the obvious common sense tells people that if you increase taxes, you're going to bring in more revenue. But as I said earlier in the speech today, it doesn't work out that way, because there's some people in this country can decide, you know, I'm paid enough taxes, I'm not going to pay more. So they disincentivize to be productive, probably do leisure or invest in non-productive activity. In your lower marginal tax rates, it encourages those people to be productive, and in the way of being productive, at the same time creating jobs, growing the economy, bringing more money into the federal treasury. When you look at the sources of the deficit, contrary to the president's claims, tax relief has been a small part. Unprecedented spending contributed much more to the deficit than the tax relief did, and particularly in the last 2 years, a 22% increase in expenditures on top of the $814 billion deficit. $814 billion stimulus. Now here's something that's probably counterintuitive too as well, and probably something the president misses from his analysis of the 2001 and 2003 tax relief bills that he blames the big budget deficit on. The tax rates, those reductions actually ended up with taxes being more progressive. The effective federal tax rate on the top 1% of the households is more than 7 times the rate paid by the bottom 20% of the households. And that's up from less than 5 times as much in the year 1979. If tax relief enacted since 2001 is allowed to expire in a little more than a year and a half, because last December we only extended the existing tax policy till December 31st, 2012, at that time, if that happens, a family of 4 with 2 kids who earn $50,000 today would see a $2,155 increase in its tax bill. More than 6 million low-income people who currently have no federal income tax liability would be subject to the individual income tax, and that would be at a rate of 15% instead of now 10%. Washington needs to learn that leaving more money in the pockets of the taxpayers unleashes a positive chain reaction in our economy. On the other hand, government spending doesn't create wealth, because government is not an institution that can create wealth. Government's an institution that can only provide an environment for people outside of the government to create wealth. And in fact, what the government does is it consumes wealth, and as a result doesn't generate a stronger economy. Instead of growing the government, Washington needs to focus on helping create private sector jobs. The president's new plan will reduce the deficit by $4 trillion over 12 years. He does that by reducing spending by $2 trillion, but raising taxes by $1 trillion, and thus lowering interest payments by $1 trillion. The president again failed to realize that we do not have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. Now, at least a couple times since I've been in the United States Senate, I've heard this argument, well, let's increase taxes $1 and we'll reduce expenditures $2 or $3 or $4. Sometimes it's $2, sometimes it's $3, sometimes it's $4 behind those ideas. Now that sounds very good, doesn't it? But here's why it doesn't work, and why bringing in $1 of new taxes actually leads to spending of $1.17, as Professor Vedder, V-E-D-D-E-R, of Ohio University has studied this. Because you increase taxes for a long, long period of time. In fact, you increase taxes until you decide to do something else with the taxes. But appropriations are reviewed annually. And for some reason or other, after that first year, appropriations tend to creep up and creep up and creep up. And consequently, the well-intentioned of raising taxes $1 and reducing expenditures by $3 or $4, as well-intended as is, it just gradually is eroded on the expenditure side. That's that half of that proposition, so that you end up not reducing expenditures as you had originally indicated. I yield the floor, Mr. President.